Our first speaker this evening is Kamran Abbasi, who is Editor-in-Chief of the British Medical Journal, and I first knew him when he was editor of the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, who have taken many of our long hectoring rants about data infrastructure in the past. The BMJ has for a very long time been a friend to the community of people that grew up in academia campaigning for better research methods, first of all. It was in many respects the spiritual home of the systematic reviews movement and the evidence-based medicine movement in the early days, when people were talking about how to move beyond an era of a kind of rather anarchic world of people publishing a hodgepodge of papers, and then if you wanted to write a summary of that work, you would just reach into a ring binder of things you'd photocopied or pull out references to the papers you remembered because they were done by your friends, and then you'd write a textbook chapter, and that would become the canonical story of the evidence for that particular medical problem and how to treat it. The evidence-based medicine movement in the 80s and 90s was a way of bringing structure to that process, inventing systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They were also big drivers of the adoption earlier than that of randomized trials as the gold standard where they are feasible for understanding the effects of treatments. And then, in the period of kind of the noughties, I still can't say that with a straight face, during the noughties, they were also big drivers for clinical trials transparency. So there was this strange paradox. People were doing clinical trials to resolve and reduce bias, but then they'd allow those biases to flood back in by allowing only half the clinical trials that were conducted and completed to be published, and it was generally a biased half, a more favorable half. In the last few years, under Kamran's leadership, the BMJ has also begun moving towards what is the next frontier and something that's very close to our heart in OpenSAFELY, and that is transparency around the code that is written for people to conduct their studies. And they've recently published what I think is an extraordinary and groundbreaking policy initiative, which is, I don't want to steal your thunder, that people who don't share their code may have some problems. And so with that, I will give you Kamran Abbasi.
Cheers. Thank you so much. It's quite jazzy in here. I've got an old school presentation, but let's see how we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about transparency and trust in medical science. I'm delighted to be here. What you do matters very deeply to us at the BMJ. I've got a lot of slides. It's going to be a whistle-stop tour through this. But I just want to tell you, this is what we're about at the BMJ, okay? It's about creating a better world, and one that prioritizes, importantly, the outcomes related to health and well-being for people on the planet. So that means above the economy, above GDP, above economic growth, this is what matters to us, right? We think the rest follows. And science, and what you're doing, is central to that. That's BMA House, forget that. We've been around since 1840. People, I guess, didn't talk about code sharing in those days, but we do now. But during the pandemic, of course, everything became so contentious about science, about data, everything being suppressed, and being more transparent and open clearly is an answer to that. But we need to also remember that we're at the centre, not just of healthcare, but improving people's health and well-being is also about the other sectors. Okay, you're going to get a bit of a lecture from me about what we're about, isn't it? It is about what's happening in housing, in transport, in education, environmentally. Everything matters, and we're interested in publishing in all of these areas that relate to health in the BMJ. But science is changing, okay? The hierarchy of science and methodology of studies is changing. Ben described the journey that we've been very intimately involved with at the BMJ. And of course, now there's a new frontier with large data sets, real world evidence with AI. And my argument to our research team is that, as Ben described, we were at the forefront of improving reporting and conduct of randomized controlled trials. We need to be at the forefront of what's happening now. Okay, and it applies equally. We can't just think there are certain set ways of doing things. We have to embrace what is new. Because research and science and peer review is at the center of what we do at the BMJ. We're rather unique. We have a lot of journalism as well as our research. We have comment, we have education. We're a very kind of different sort of medical journal. And often where we lead, other people tend not to follow. I don't know why that is. But they just don't follow us. But we think it's the right thing to do. This is about how our paper, we publish about 2% of papers, okay? So if you get your paper published in the BMJ, you've overcome a lot of hurdles. Doesn't mean it's a bad paper, but it's a very highly selective process. This is what the process looks like a bit. We tried to map it. It's very complicated. I haven't got time to go into that today. If you want to ask me, I'll be sticking around. But our values are very important to us, okay? So Ben talked about the evidence being evidence-based. I'll link that to being open and transparent and trusted, because that's central to what we're doing. The two things go together. Being patient-centered and forget customer focus, that's for our business people. But being courageous and independent. We are independent of the BMA, and I fight to maintain that on a daily basis, let me assure you. But we are independent of the BMA. We're absolutely editorially free to do what we want. And we live our values, okay? They matter to us deeply. But evidence matters to us a lot. And one of the people who kind of created modern evidence-based medicine is Dave Sackett. And he talked about how we need to use it to apply to individuals. That doesn't mean we can't adapt it and use it to we're not rigidly following the evidence, but it needs to inform our practice. Another landmark editorial written in the BMJ was this one by a guy called Doug Altman, who's from Oxford, as Dave Sackett was, but he was one of probably the most eminent medical statistician. And in 1994, he wrote, "We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons." Those words are still apt and true today. And it also applies to being able to reproduce research, which is the business of trusted research environments and the outputs of OpenSAFELY. But we have a problem. It's like the rhyme of the ancient mariner. There's too much information. I'm going back to some of the foundations as to why we do what we do. The rhyme of the ancient mariner, some of you may know this, sailors are on a ship, there's no water, there's water everywhere, but they can't drink any. Water everywhere, not any drop to drink. This was adapted by Muir Gray, another person. Everybody's from Oxford, aren't they, all the leading thinkers here? And he said, we're overwhelmed by information, but can't find the information we need when we need it. Okay, and then there are but unfortunately that's all unstuck a little bit, and there are many problems with evidence-based medicine, and this was a paper written in the BMJ before the pandemic saying we need a new manifesto to fix the problems with evidence-based medicine. We believe in it, it needs fixing, and the pandemic exposed many more. I won't go into them, I've got time to go into them. In 2004, when I was the acting editor of the BMJ, I wrote this piece talking about transparency and trust, saying that actually our whole enterprise, the journal enterprise, relies on these two things, transparency and trust. We can't scrutinize everything that we receive, all the papers that we receive. We're trusting authors to be transparent, in what they're saying they did in terms of their research. And so there's a bit of kind of uncertainty in that. And how we fix that is a bit of a problem, but perhaps you fixed it. Let's find out. And as Ben was saying, we led on registering clinical trials because we believe in openness and transparency. This was about being open and transparent in research, but also about fixing the problem of publication bias. And again, I was acting editor when we actually introduced this policy in 2004. And then my predecessor, Fiona Godley, launched this campaign on open data, which I think Ben and co were involved with. And a lot of this was about reanalyzing randomized control trials once the data were available and finding very different findings to what the pharma companies, for example, had found. They're just examples, I won't go into them too much. But even back in 2016, we had Ben writing to us and saying all BMJ research papers should share their analytic code. Now, I'll be honest with you, we spoke a lot about the data and how data should be open and transparent and available on request. But I don't think we sort of understood about code. It was like, code, what is that? Is that something you do on your ZX Spectrum? We don't sort of understand it too much. And when we spoke to our statisticians and our hanging committee, our advisors about it, it was very difficult, it's complicated, we can't get people to share their code because it's very hard to do. How do they do it? So I think it got parked, and I think not for very good reasons, actually. But Ben kept at it, okay? And Ben and Nick wrote this editorial back in 2019 saying why researchers should share their analytic code. And this kind of got lost because then the next thing was the pandemic. But it stuck with me. And my whole philosophy is if there's the right thing to do, if you know what the right thing to do is, just do it, right? If you've got the power to do it, do it. What's stopping you? Don't be held back by others or the establishment. So we got a bit distracted, but when the pandemic was over, we went back to this. And there were other people, we had other papers supporting code sharing in particular. And there were some good ideas that we might have, for example, some kind of tagging on papers that suggests that this is, some kind of open, this is part of open research, and it's a good thing to do. And so since that time, we've been having conversations with Ben, with Nick, and with others to think, well, should we change our policy? And this was really reinforced, actually, because once people started looking at how successful data sharing, code sharing was, they found it was not at all successful, okay? And here's a meta-analysis we published in the BMJ. It was 105 meta-research studies, in fact. And the bottom line is, what they found was that very few people were willing to share their data. And at that time, we had a policy of saying, you share your data on reasonable request. And we also had the same for code. But as I say, we sort of didn't understand code in the way that you do. And what these data show, what this study showed was actually less than 10% of authors were willing to share their data, and in fact, an even smaller proportion ended up sharing it when it was requested of them. And it was worse for code, okay? So, God, I've suddenly gone loud there, so I don't know how that happened. So if we look at the data here, it says here, 8% of medical articles published between 2016 and 2021 reported that the data were publicly available, and 2% actually shared their data. For public code sharing, the prevalence of declared and actual code sharing were estimated to be 0.3%, and 0.1% respect. How awful, that's just pathetic, right? And so, I mean, clearly, it's like most voluntary schemes. They don't work. This had failed. And again, if you looked at private code sharing, that was no better. And so I thought, right, enough of this. We have to do something. Whether anybody else backs us or not, whatever complications it causes, we're going to go ahead and do this. And so we wrote this editorial. As I say, we had input from Ben and Nick and co about how we might do this in the best possible way. And we announced it earlier this year. I'm really delighted we did it. It caused some massive problems internally, people saying, well, how are we going to do this? But our policy is this, that for all clinical trials, you have to share your data before we publish your trial, and that doesn't apply to observational studies or to cohort studies, but for all studies, you have to share your code because it's possible to do so. So that's great. And look at the kind of papers you get. I mean, we're already publishing papers that were true to this principle. And the beauty of this is, I mean, you managed to analyze 12 million adults. These are large data sets that you're working with in an open and transparent manner, answering very real, live questions that matter, and doing it relatively quickly. So it's a very, very important resource, and very important that we have ways of tackling and dealing with this kind of information. And you also manage to get lots of authors to publish on those kinds of papers, so that's good for you. And they get well read. Look at the alt metrics and the kind of how much it's shared. So the value of this kind of information is very, very important. But look, in the world of journals, there are many problems at the moment, many challenges we're facing. One is artificial intelligence. What the hell do we do about it? Is it the fourth industrial revolution? We're in the middle of a paradigm shift. We're being besieged in medical journals through fraud, research misconduct, like never before. And open access publishing has made that more of a challenge. The business model of journals is being challenged. So we're in a bit of a, I think we've never had a situation like this. It's a bit of a firestorm. And that's why I think holding transparency and trust and values dear to you are absolutely important at this time more than ever. I won't go into these slides. This is really Hindawi, which retracted 8,000 articles, okay, in 1 year. And I tell you, this year it's going to be worse. There are big publishers planning to retract 16,000, 20,000 papers, and you'll find out about that towards the end of the year. And then the predatory journals that are now being exposed and being removed from indexing. So we've got a lot of problems, but I think there are 10 areas of focus for us. And one of them, and I didn't write this slide for today. This is a slide I wrote a year ago. There's the opportunity of real-world data, large data sets, trusted research environments. This is very, very important to the future of medical science. And what that means for us on journals, that there are three principles for journals to retain trust facing all these challenges. One is quality. I think peer review, we've always had our doubts about it, but it's become not fit for purpose. It's rather formulaic. People don't really engage with papers. It's a kind of robotic process. There has to be something more than that, something I think we do at the BMJ. Let's describe it as peer review plus. There also has to be diversity. Diversity is important in many ways, but diversity of ideas and methodologies and approaches, we need that now at this time. But still we need integrity. Okay? Integrity is central to what we do. So we need to correct the record, retract things that we believe aren't accurate or that are fraudulent as well. So what is the value of trusted research environments and OpenSAFELY in all of this? Well, they deliver quality, diversity, and integrity. There's data sharing. With code sharing built in, it's mandated. What could be better than that? It solves the problem of sharing routinely collected observational data, which is a challenge for us at the BMJ, and it allows all of you to work with large data sets. It goes back to what I was saying in 2004. This is an exercise in transparency and trust in medical science. I want to thank you and everybody involved for what you're doing, because you're actually fulfilling what we should be doing in terms of medical science, in terms of how we work on behalf of patients and the public. And it also gets you published in the BMJ. These are 6 papers in the BMJ, OpenSAFELY papers. We have other journals, BMJ Medicine, here's 4, there are 2 in BMJ Mental Health, BMJ Open. You get into our publications because this is credible science done in a timely manner on important topics. So, I just want to leave you with this, and I think this is what trusted research environments do. And George Bernard Shaw wrote, if you have an apple and I have an apple and we exchange apples, he probably didn't say it like this, then you and I will still each have 1 apple. But if you have an idea and I have an idea and we exchange these ideas, then each of us will have 2 ideas. That's what you're doing. That's what OpenSAFELY and trusted research environments are doing. They're allowing us to share ideas, to increase the sum of knowledge. And I think we all have to get together to act on this. And one of my favorite quotes from this year is from Michelle Obama, and ultimately unsuccessful, but she did say at the Democratic Convention, if we start feeling tired, if we start feeling that dread creeping back in, because it does when you're pioneering, you're trying to change things, when you're trying to lead and people don't follow, you have to keep going if you believe it's the right thing to do. We've got to pick ourselves up, throw water on our faces, and do something. Okay? And that's right for us. We should do something. And remember, a better world is one that prioritizes outcomes related to health and well-being of people on the planet. That's what you're all involved in and all helping to deliver. So I want to thank you for that, and thank you for listening to me.